All right. Okay. Well, my name's Gwenda Davey, and I'm the chair of the Melbourne branch of the Friends of the Film and Sound Archive. Welcome, everybody, this afternoon. I'm very, very pleased to welcome Graham Dodsworth here to speak to us this afternoon. Graham is a musician and an oral historian. He's carried out many interviews and oral history recordings for both the National Library and for the National Film and Sound Archive. And the ones he's got showing on his back picture are just an example of the many. He's going to share some of his findings with us today, and using the rather intriguing title for his talk called Second Guessing Future Curiosity. Please put your queries and comments on the chat. We'll take them at the end, okay? So without further ado, I'll say welcome, Graham, and please let us have your talk about your collecting as an oral historian. Thank you.
Thanks, Gwenda. My camera's gone off. So I'll start by saying, as an interviewer of any, I guess for any institution or in any way, you have to sort of second guess what people want to hear and listen to. I've taken excerpts from a number of these interviews, but there are quite a few which I couldn't get the information as to whether they were still released still or not. So I couldn't use quite a bit of that, quite a few of those, and I'm just going to have to restart my camera altogether.
Today is the 21st of May 2010. I'm Graham Dodsworth, and this is an interview with James Raine, who would like to thank and welcome to the Melbourne studios of the National Film and Sound Archive.
So that's just a typical intro that I would do. Sometimes, they vary a bit, and they've varied over the years. For James, I had some specific questions that I wanted to ask him, but I wasn't able to play them back for you. But I was really interested in that one there in particular, but I couldn't actually play you back the answer. And I'm at sea as to whether I did eventually ask that question. I think I did. There's James and I.
I was born in Lagos, Nigeria, and we were there because I have an Australian mother and English father, and my father had been in the Royal Marines. He was a captain in the Royal Marines, and he was commissioned to be the Queen's ADC, and I was born there, as was my brother. I was born in 1957, my brother was born in 1959.
This is Phil Manning.
It's Graham Dodsworth here from the National Film and Sound Archive. I'm interviewing Phil Manning of the Australian rock band Chain, and we'll be discussing his career in general and various parts in particular as part of the National Film and Sound Archive Oral History Program. Today is the 29th of March 2011. Phil, on what day were you born?
Born on the 2nd of the 3rd, 1948.
Today is the 6th of April 2022. I'm Graham Dodsworth, and this is a National Film and Sound Archive oral history with nationally known songwriter and performer Kelly Orty. Where and when were you born?
I was born in 1958 in the Mooroopna Base Hospital, which is just across the bridge from Shepparton.
I was born on the 6th of November 1951 at the Royal North Shore Hospital.
Okay.
St Leonard's.
The 30th of June, 1955. I was born in Melbourne, but my parents at the time lived in a little town in the Western District called Wallora.
I was born in Kings Meadows House in Peebles, Scotland, the 23rd of September 1944 at approximately 4:05 a.m.
I was born on the 29th of June 1953.
Okay, and where was that?
It was in a town called Colwinning in Ayrshire in Scotland.
I'll just mention here for anyone listening that there are cicadas, if we're from New South Wales, in the background. Outside we have a double-skinned room except for one door, unfortunately, and the odd blowfly, which we can't get out.
There's often the odd sound in the background, and you can't do a lot about it. I think one of the ones I did for Gwenda for the National Library, we had an emu pecking at the window on occasion, and there's even in the studios of the NFSA, there's can be problems like construction next door, drilling through the walls and stuff like that. And even the last interview I did a couple of weeks ago, the aircon in the studio is too loud. I don't think I'll be using that studio at South Bank again, but that's just the way it is sometimes. So that was just a quick smattering of how they start. I'll just go back to me. I guess I could perhaps use too many examples, but anyway, now I'll just give you some interesting things that I found when interviewing. I generally start with that question of where were you born, and then I head backwards by saying, and how did your parents come to be living there at that time? And they give me a bit of an idea of those things, of why and when, and I sometimes get some immigration or whatever it is. And I'm also after any like any ancestors that have been musicians and that sort of thing. Now, Bogle was an interesting one in that sense.
My grandfather, William Browning, was a well-known musician. Any musical talent I think, came down through my mother's side. The group actually played at the London Palladium, so they were pretty popular. I actually have copies of tapes of 4 78 records that they made for Biltona Records in Scotland in 1932. And if I listen to the recordings, it's amazing the similarities between his group and my sort of groups that I use, because surprisingly there's a bit of chat, a few jokes, and then some music, and that's exactly what I do.
Yes.
And the jokes are really corny, but it's really fun to listen to them. So almost a straight line between him and me, really.
Yes.
When I listen to the recording, I think, my God, I do that.
When I interviewed Mark Holden in 2008, he spoke of when he was in the state. He went to the States to find relations there, and I think it was an uncle that had died. But he was put in touch with a cousin who had a studio pretty much the same as Mark had, and was doing all the same, producing artists and doing pretty much the same things as Mark was doing, and that was a cousin. So I find it quite interesting that relations often end up doing similar stuff. Just an example of the release forms. I'm not going to show you. Bogle picked option A, and then but then can be a bit confusing because he picked A. He doesn't need to pick any options from C, but he did anyway, which a lot of people do. It's a bit confusing, the form, and I'm always a bit worried about why do you get to have to sign a sheet of paper that doesn't actually have the other stuff that's pertinent to that signature on the same page. I always find that weird, but that's common with contracts. That's Phil Manning, who explained that his father was into electronics and very much so, and he actually built a television camera. He was so much into it. Now, the relevance of this will become obvious.
Your aunties will play piano, your mother played piano, and your father was into electronics and that sort of stuff. And we were having a little chat during the break. I was fascinated to hear about, the television project during 1956 that you mentioned. Can you tell us what was going on then?
Well,
Olympic Games.
Dad, being the electronics nut that he was, it was his job, but it was also his hobby. He just loved it, and he built around about that time. Well, it might have been a little bit later actually, but around about that time, of course, black and white TV had come online in Melbourne.
Yes, that's right, 1956.
And we were living on the northwest coast of Tasmania, and Dad built this outrageous high aerial in our backyard, so that he could pick up Melbourne TV.
Wow!
And we had sort of pretty much the first TV on the northwest coast, or in our area anyway. I know that. I'd come running home from school to see the Olympic Games on TV, and I wouldn't be able to get into the lounge room because of all the neighbours.
Yes.
So Dad That was a pretty exciting time, really, the advent of television.
You had to have a real understanding of the electronics to know that you could even bother trying to get a signal from Melbourne, you know what I mean, let alone being able to put it together or attempt it. Yeah. He's known that it was possible, and he's actually done it.
Yeah, well, later on, Dad built a he built a TV camera and transmitter.
See, I think that's a huge understanding of electronics. His father did some of that when he was in the army or the military, and I didn't get. I'm not sure I got to the bottom of whether he worked in signals and ciphers, but Al Ward's father certainly did.
He was in ciphers and signals. My father was a Royal Air Force man. He'd been sent to Australia after victory in Europe to, as he said it when I was a child, to whip the nip. And he met my mother. They were both in the Air Force. They met in the Sergeant's Mess, actually, at Bradfield Park.
Right.
Which was a facility, an Air Force facility, and he was Royal Air Force, she was Royal Australian Air Force. She was a sergeant drill instructor, PT instructor.
Oh, yes.
He was in ciphers and signals.
So very secret work, and Doug Ashdown the same.
And he worked for for the weapons research establishment out at Edinburgh, Salisbury, and they were working on. It was quite. I mean, most of the things I think he did were quite secret,
And the thing is, it was only that I interviewed Doug and Al Ward a couple of, I did Doug in Adelaide one week, and I was in Sydney a couple of weeks later for Al. That I sort of picked this up and then noticed that Phil was saying, and I'd love to do a study of just what the parents of some of these, particularly the ones who were right into playing intricate guitar. But anyway, this is what story that came out of this is that obviously Doug's father worked in signals and ciphers, as Al put it, because of this particular story, which Doug didn't actually quite realise what was going on, I don't think, until we chatted about it later.
My father always caught a bus to work, and evidently one day he was going to the bus station and he said, today I'm going to get a train for a change. And he caught a train and the bus station was hit and wiped out. The time he would have been there. My mother swears she sat up in bed and she knew something had happened. Like some sort of telepathy or something. But he caught the train instead of the bus, and he probably would have been killed if he caught the bus. And he always caught the bus, so very strange.
Yeah, well, see, I put it to him. I said, well, maybe if he worked in ciphers, maybe he knew it was going to blow up. But to reveal to anybody that he knew that would have probably let the Germans, in this case, know that they'd cracked their code. It seemed fairly obvious to me, but anyway. But anyway, the point of playing these things is, I think it's interesting that the caliber of the genetics involved is interesting. I guess, I don't know what it says or what you'd want to do with that. Probably nothing, but I just found it interesting. Also, I found a common theme in a lot of the interviews was that none of the big bands made any money. Men at Work did, and Hunters and Collectors did, but only because I think in Hunters and Collectors case, Doug Falconer, he really got on top of the finances. I mean, he was paying the band members. He was paying the band members superannuation, for instance, which none of the other bands that, to my knowledge, did. A lot of them discussed actually running into debt as a result of being famous and making a lot of money, particularly the Bushwhackers who went on tour in the UK a few times, and kind of Jan and Mick Slocum. They made a loss every time and had to borrow money to come back.
You've got a manager taking 20% off the top. You've got an agent taking 12.5%,
as well
off the top. Either way is
yeah.
that 20% of $1,000 is $200,
Yeah.
which leaves you $800 to pay the truck, the PA, the crew, the petrol, the motels.
But anyway, here's what Rose had to say about this, Goanna's stint.
I've got to have a break from this, so I got a job at the Hotel Como. Friend was the executive chef there, and I went and chefed for 3 years.
Did you?
Yeah.
So you're done cooking?
No, I hadn't. I fell into it. She was having staff problems, and she said, "Look, I know you can cook. Would you come in and just be my sidekick for a while and help me straighten this out?" Anyway, I ended up being the executive chef there. Had 60 staff and cooked hands-on.
Yeah. So she'd known you from dinner parties and suddenly and now you're executive chef all of a sudden.
Yeah. Well, that happened after a while.
Obviously.
Yeah, because I could take the heat and I knew how to deal with people. And
I asked David Hirschfelder later on about what it takes to be successful in the business, and but yeah, obviously to keep going is one of the ways to do it. Here's James Rain again.
My mother was she was very interested when she was a student, when she was at Melbourne University. I think she did a lot of things. My mother was a soprano. She sang in a lot of just local amateur, sort of Gilbert and Sullivan. She did have, I believe, she had a radio show for a minute with a good woman who was her best friend at university called Glenn Tomasetti, who's quite well known. And they had, I think they did French folk music, because she spoke. My mother speaks French, and she became a French teacher. But she lived in France. She got a job at the Australian Embassy. So when she came back, I think she had some show on the ABC doing French. Must have been on a Sunday afternoon or something. But with Glenn, and Glenn was a folk singer as well.
And was Glenn's children's involvement in television and acting any sort of influence on your family?
Glenn Tomasetti's?
Yes.
No, because
Claire and
No, because I didn't. This is the first I knew that. I only knew about them. Well, we met Glenn.
Claire was in Bellbird, yeah.
Of course she was. That's right. That's why I remember we used to watch Bellbird all the time.
So, and quite often I find that I mean, you can't. We get impressions from our interviewees. They don't always. They don't always know what they did themselves. But you might interview 3 or 4 members from the same band, and they'll tell you 3 or 4 different stories about the same incident, and they're not lying. They just have they just remember it differently. But that's. But family background, I think, obviously it's an important thing with all of these things. And I ask a lot of the people if there's sort of much music in their, a lot of the interviewees, if there's much music in their family, and quite often they'll say no, as did Al Ward originally. And his answers are interesting.
Do you remember pianos in the house?
No, there was nothing. There was absolutely nothing.
But then there's more.
The only singing that went on was my sister and I would come home from school. We had rooms with a paper, separate rooms. Walls were thin.
Yes.
It was a housing commission house. So we were in this housing commission house, and at night we would sing harmony together. She'd be in bed and I'd be in my bed, and we would sing songs we'd learnt at school or at Sunday school.
Yes.
So, and the thing I remember very clearly is I'd be lying in bed and I'd start, come follow, 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 follow me. and she would start, and we'd sing the round. And we'd sing happily until the parents said, shut up!
So, and then there's, and of course then there's this.
I joined a church choir when I was 12, and I was put through the test of, sing this and see how you go.
Yeah.
And the man said to me, the choir leader, you're singing perfect harmony, where did you learn to harmonise? And I said, well, what's that?
Yeah.
Because I thought I was just singing along with everyone else.
Yeah.
He said, no, you're singing lovely harmony and descant and such things. And I didn't know what he was talking about.
No.
And he said, well, just keep doing it.
And this is an interesting bit from Rose Bygrave, who she tells you she learnt piano formally at first and didn't get on with it, and then her sister did it, and then she gave up, but her sister persisted, and the last lesson her sister had, she never played again, whereas Rose, who just taught herself at home, ends up being one of Australia's best known keyboard players. So there's an interesting thing about formal training. The theory I've often had, and I do ask interviewees about it, is that, you know, I've found that people who learn formally to play music, basically the only thing you ever get to do is to teach it formally. And a lot of the professional performers, you know, I could be wrong, ask around, but I have, and they say, well, they taught themselves mainly. They might have had 2 or 3 lessons, but generally they've become who they are by, or they've done what they've achieved by just playing a lot.
So she'd play the piece on the piano, a 3 blind mice or whatever she plays,
Yes.
and I'd be able to play that without looking at the notes.
Well, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yes, and then she would say, where are you up to?
Yeah, right, and you had no idea.
And I had no idea where I was up to on the thing, and I'd get this whack across the fingers. So
oh, really? So
it was the
she used a
standard.
nun style.
It was ferocious, yeah. So after about 6 lessons, I said to Mum, I don't want to do it anymore. Well, my sister learned, but she learnt the proper way. She learnt to sight read and stuff, and it would infuriate her because she'd come home with a piece like, I don't know, Green Sleeves, yeah, and be struggling away with the notes and stuff, and I'd go in half an hour later and play it. She'd go, what's the point?
And how much piano does your sister play?
She doesn't play at all now. I think she sort of gave up by the time she got to secondary school. She'd given up. Frustration. And I think
who was she learning from? The same teacher? Or?
Same teacher, yeah.
The only thing I can remember our family doing together, Sunday night, round the radio, we'd listen to Orson Welles, The Black Museum, and then we'd listen to Vera Lynn sings.
Right.
And that was every Sunday, right? And that was the only thing our family did together. So it remains quite a warm memory.
Yes.
Saturday nights, my father would roll home to the pub with his mates, all half pissed, and they'd get out their combs and their accordions and their mouthies and, you know, spoons.
Yes.
And sing.
All right.
And play tunes. Quite a few of them were members or ex-members of the pipe band, the local pipe band. So I heard a lot of music in the house.
And you said they played comb, and you said mouthies or moothies.
Mouth organs, yeah.
Oh, mouth organs, right. And
spoons.
Spoons. So they would grab
And
the
Taff.
spoons from the drawer.
Taff Aiken would have his accordion. Taff was a good accordion.
Okay.
So live music, making music was just part of my growing up. There was nothing strange about it, you know. And it is the same for all my generation. Well, not all of us, but most of us. So it was a good grounding.
The fact that it's stereo is that they want the NFSA, and as far as I recall, the library does too, they like it to be complete separation. Well, not complete separation, but, you know, the interviewee in one ear and the interviewer in the other. So I guess that's how they can rebalance it if that needs to happen, or if there's any rotten noises, they can edit them out a bit better. Or if I start mucking around with a microphone or something. And Ruth, here's one for you, Ruth.
You know, at school we used to do lots of games with accompanying songs and chants. I mean, it was part of our heritage, if you like.
This is primary school, you say?
Yeah.
So what sort of chants?
Well, all the girls had their skipping chants.
Yep.
I didn't skip, so I can't tell you.
No.
And you too, Judy, of course, and Gwenda, who worked on the childhood tradition and change.
What about, particularly about family influence? Are you talking about?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I always ask whether they were singing in the car and whether they sang around the piano, as you heard earlier. I don't know if I always ask questions about, you know, skipping rhymes in the playground, which.
And I think there's no doubt the family influences are extremely important. I mean, I know right from the time it was the age 3. I think it was in a way my father who turned me into a folk singer. He used to teach me German folk songs when I was about 3 years old. But there was then, of course, we graduated to the pianola, and the pianola is an issue. I'm still hoping that one day we'll be able to have a session for this from the Friends with the pianola at Ripponlea, which was actually my old family pianola. And I know but of course COVID is one of the many things that COVID wrecked. But we're going to bring it back to life in the near future. And also, probably a good time to just mention here, since you've been talking about, you did mention the advent of TV in 1956, and we've at last fixed a date to have our pioneer of early television, Susie Anderson, who's going to talk for us in the end of June. So in June, that's something to look forward to. But yeah, anyway, there's a number of issues that have really come up, Graham. But anyway, that's enough talk from me. Please carry on.
Okay, so I'm going to move to, rather than jump around so much with different interviewees, I'm going to, one of the most interesting interviewees I had was David Hirschfelder, who of course has scored for film. And having had some of the tidbits, you're probably more interested in the detail of such a person. I'm going to let Rose Bygrave intro him, and then give you a little bit of context for those who haven't heard of him.
I went back to grammar school the other day. They did a concert of the century thing, and now they've got this most beautiful auditorium, the Wendouree Performing Arts Centre, which is attached to Ballarat Grammar School. The grammar school now has just got a great guy who's the music director, Andrew Dale, and they have a full orchestral section, timpanis, the lot. So they've added this beautiful auditorium, recording studios, piano suites, Steinbeck piano.
Probably not.
What's this?
Steinway.
Steinway.
That's right.
Steinbeck was the bass.
He's the author.
As the author.
Yes.
Steinberger is the bass. You know, the carbon fibre bass they used to have? Yeah, Steinway, that's it.
The Steinway piano, yeah.
Yeah, and all that sort of stuff. And it was interesting because it was a full auditorium of past students and teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd been to school with people like David Hobson and David Hirschfelder, and a group of really wonderful kind of classical pianists and violin
Just explain
players.
who they are.
Dave Hobson is quite a renowned tenor, operatic tenor, and he's had, kind of a fairly stellar career in Australia. Dave Hirschfelder started off in various bands like John Farnham, but Dave's really a composer, and he's done a lot of work with film, like serious writing for composing for films like Elizabeth. I think his first score would have been Strictly Ballroom.
Okay, yes.
So then Elizabeth and a lot of other things too.
So there was a lot of music going on at that school, and it transposed into successful musicians.
She mentions how David and she and other people at her school were successful. I found that Peter Howe, the bass player, went to school with a number of people as well. They all sort of, in their own individually, became well known in Australia. I won't list them all, won't list any of them. But anyway, here's David Hirschfeld.
After the war, which knocked everyone around a bit, obviously, the Second World War, my grandfather, my mother's father, wanted to move to Australia. And so they signed up to the old, what was known as the £10 POM scheme.
Yes.
So they spent £10 each, and that paid for their travel on a boat and relocation to Australia. When we were young, we were a very nomadic family. We lived in Frankston, we lived in Springvale for a while, then we moved to Canberra, then Bathurst, then most of my childhood was in Ballarat, Victoria. And
Why was all the moving? Why was all the...
my father was a pilot, and he was a migrant. After the war, he was a German migrant. So with a German accent post-World War II wasn't a popular accent to have, unfortunately, at the time. So he moved around. He wanted to come to Australia and moved around a lot and worked very, very hard to forge his own life and his own career from nothing. And it took him a long time to realise his dream of being an agricultural pilot. And in the process of doing that, it took us to living in many different places. We almost moved to Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea at one stage.
Yeah.
Both my parents consciously and unconsciously instilled into me a strong work ethic and an appreciation and an embracement of discipline. And, you know, I enjoyed hard work. I enjoyed the hours of practicing the piano because I felt that was what my father got up at 5 in the morning and went flying aircraft, so I'm going to get up at 5 in the morning and practice the piano.
I mean, not everybody gets to score big movies, I guess. So do you attribute that work ethic to the success?
I think that needs to be combined with the right attitude. And I'm not saying I'm a good boy and have the right attitude, but I guess I was blessed not only with a talent, but I was trained in the right attitude, which is to go for it. And, you know, the Nike saying is just do it. And I think that I was trained to just do it and get on with it. You need a bit of an ego and a bit of you need your own sense of identity to make decisions and do your job, but in a way you've got to get out. The ego has to step aside and take a back seat and allow the real, each of us has a real being that inside that just has a lot more power than our ego, and I think it's a matter of learning to trust that and not have the ego grappling for recognition. And even though it's, I'll be honest with you and say I've enjoyed the recognition of people saying, you did that, that's great, I like your work. And that is, it's delightful to have that recognition and to be recognised for having done something. But even that, as wonderful as that is, and that's more alluring than any money or that is fame. That's people who go for fame for its own sake are going to have a hollow victory, because in the end the only thing that really feels good is when you know that you've facilitated some good work. Little River Band was sort of on the downward curve when John and I happened to join the band, and we didn't take that personally. I think it was I'm saying that in jest, of course, but we were sort of, I guess, thinking, well, perhaps the band's run its course, and the band, in fact, did disband after a little while, and that's when John wanted to make a solo record, and I agreed to help him on Whispering Jack in 1986. We started work on that. I think, was it 86 or 87? It came out, it sort of hit, yes, I think it was released late 86, early 87. But at the time when we were making that record, we were huddled in a little garage in a house John was renting, because at the time he'd
gone back to plumbing, hadn't he?
Virtually.
Yeah.
He might as well have. He was on the bones of his arse, as he would say. He was in debt and struggling and renting a humble house in Bulleen. And I set up with him a studio in his garage, and we made Whispering Jack really on the smell of an oily rag, pretty much, with my equipment that I had. Much of it was rented as well. And we produced this record, which became the highest selling record in Australian history. So I took all my equipment, the Fairlight, I had Yamaha sequencers, which I had QX, which was a QX1. I had a drum machine. I had a collection of fairly rudimentary but still powerful music production tools of the day. DX7 synthesizer, Prophet 5 synthesizers.
Which computer would you have been using at that point?
No computers were around then. There was not even I don't even think, if Commodore 64s were there, they were only used for, business people and things like that. Musicians weren't really using them.
Oh, I was.
Where?
Yeah, in 86, 87, I was sequencing my Mirage via a Commodore 64.
Commodore 64.
And sampling and using, not using, the Mirage was a sampler, but it's mainly sequencing.
Well, I was sequencing on the Fairlight. You could sequence on the Fairlight. You could sequence on the Yamaha QX1. It was an 8-track sequencer, and you played the sounds in, and then you could quantize them. So
probably a lot more reliable than the Commodore.
It was
too tiny.
To be honest, it was probably the most powerful thing you could get at that time, even though the Commodore, of course, was the beginning of what is now the standard practice, which is you have a computer and a screen and you see everything on a screen. The Fairlight had that, so I was the Fairlight had quite a similar, albeit rudimentary.
Well, these keyboards are computers, really, but that's right.
So the Fairlight was a computer. Well, it was a CMI, computer musical instrument. So it was a computer, but it was all about. I mean, here's the thing with me is. It took me years before I realised, I've got computers, I could type a letter and print it out. Or I could get email and email people. I mean, I was using computers. The first computer I got was in 1990, and it was a Mac, and I ran Digital Performer. Performer. Before it was Digital Performer. I ran Performer, which is a sequencing software program, and that's what I did, strictly ballroom on that computer. And I was using the computer similar to that for about 4 years, and in about 1993 I realised, I could buy a printer and I could type letters and print them out and fax them to people. I think my understanding and development and growth as an electronic musician started through keyboards. So I would only relate to the technology that was attached to a keyboard, and then as that transferred into more abstract concepts like a box called a sequencer, which stores keyboard performances. Again, it's still related to a keyboard because I'm a keyboard player and even when I was composing, I would still scribble, and when I was doing string arrangements, I would still write them down on paper first initially, and then play those ideas into the technology. Whereas, of course, now I can just play it all in, and then the computer can then, with a little bit of editing, you can print out what you play in, and you can now and have been able to do for many years, combine the act of keyboard. In fact, the keyboard becomes, now I see it as a typewriter.
And how did that transition from, when you were composing orchestral pieces, I suppose, but using samples, was that by and large, I guess, the vehicle that allowed you to then get to a position where eventually you'd actually use real orchestras?
Absolutely, yes. Using samples.
That must be wonderful.
Using samples, and I still do use samples now, and they're much more sophisticated and expressive libraries that simulate in more detail, not in total detail, but getting closer to the kind of detail which you can still abuse and make hyper-real orchestrations which don't sound like an actual orchestra but can resemble it or sound like a robotic gargantuan sort of perversion of an actual orchestra. Yes, my grandmother, she was a concert pianist, and she was a wonderful classical pianist. Obviously the war didn't do a lot for her career, and then having a war and children to look after forced her to shelve her career probably permanently. But she played piano right up until well into her 90s.
Oh, really?
And I remember that the last time I spent with her was in the late 80s, and I was touring in Germany, and we sat at the piano and played together. And she could play by ear, she could extemporise. So I guess I received a fair amount of talent from her DNA. And then also my mother is a very fine singer, and she was she's been on stage. She has a beautiful soprano voice, and she's been involved in music theatre and light opera productions over the years. She doesn't sing anymore. The first synth was a Roland SH5.
I had one of those.
Did you?
Yeah, they were great with all the knobs.
Yeah,
yeah.
The knobs, and of course, there were, as you can remember, there was no programmability. You couldn't store your sound. You had to
remember everything every
and
time.
move the sliders. So I got very quick at it. Was a monophonic synth, as you know. So
yes,
I could change. I learned very quickly how to move the ADSRs, the
two of
envelopes.
those, I think.
Yeah, to change it from single string lines, so it would just play sort of single line string parts, and then within a few flicks of a switch I could do a sort of a Chick Corea or Jan Hammer style synth solo, trying to sound like a Moog. I never owned a Moog, a mini Moog. I would have loved to have owned one of those. They were
so
very
why
cool.
did you choose the SH5? Because at the time I think there was the SH5, the ARP,
Odyssey,
the Moog, DX7, Yamaha DX7, and
well, DX7s,
the DX7's quite out yet.
No, the DX7s came in the 80s,
Right.
the early 80s, but in the late 70s, right through the 70s, the synths were monophonic.
Yeah, and there was a string ensemble.
And then there was a Selena string ensemble, which I did have for a while. And then there was the ARP. ARP made sort of string ensembles or rudimentary. There was all sorts of keyboard. There was the clavinet, which was a cool instrument. I loved the clavinet. Then I got an ARP Quadra, which had 4 notes, which could, by as the name suggests, you could play 4 notes on it. So it had 4-note polyphony, and it was the first programmable keyboard I had. You could store presets.
Yes.
But then the coolest one of those I got, which was in 1980 or was it 81, was the Prophet 5. My name was known to Ted Albert of Albert's Publishing. Ted, as you may or may not know, is the man behind. He was born into the Albert's Publishing house, but he was the man who pretty much put or believed in and supported and AC/DC, John Young, a whole lot of Albert's artists. What was the other one? Ted Mulry Gang.
Yes.
All these rock and rollers in the early 70s. And so it seemed odd that a man like that would be interested in a sort of a somewhat burlesque affair like Strictly Ballroom. But he was interested. He fell in love with Baz's play. Baz had done a play of Strictly Ballroom, and I think Ted Albert just went up to Baz and said, "This is make a great movie, but you need a good musician to help tell the story." So I think that's when Baz scoured around and found me, and was aware of my work, and that's how that started. So that was my first feature film, Strictly Ballroom.
So I'm sure you all heard the trams and going in the background, and occasionally in the right or left ear, depending how you got your system set up, you can hear the door of the National Film and Sound Archive opening and closing. And although they've moved, you get the same thing today in the studio. So you'd think that the studios of the NFSA would be the ideal environment, but it's not. And a while back when they were drilling through the wall, you can't help that kind of thing. I had to try and find an alternate interview venue for Ross Ryan, to interview Ross Ryan. It took me days to try and find somewhere, and I'm not sure I did in the end.
Some of those venues are just too live, aren't they?
Well, the current one has the aircon. Just that's pretty obvious. That's not going to work. And the one at South Melbourne, I don't recall too many issues, but I only did a few there, and then the one in Flinders Street. Well, that was where we were with David, and you could hear those trams. You could hear the trams going flat out, and you get the odd siren. You can get sirens just about anywhere, but of course, in Sydney officers weren't too bad. But one of those interviews I did in Sydney, I actually did in the Blue Mountains, as you heard, with Wood, and it was cicadas everywhere. They call them cicadas there. But in the actual studio where I did another interview with Leonie Smith, was pretty much okay from memory. I didn't sort of audition that again, but she was interesting because she'd been doing interviews in Second Life. Like, she'd had a whole television studio set up a virtual television studio set up in Second Life, and she even had crews who would operate different cameras. They'd have their own avatars, I suppose, and they'd operate different and edit the thing. So she interviewed, I don't know how many people, it was quite a number, and she would interview them in a virtual studio. That was quite a fascinating thing, and I did an interview with her. Both in the studio, of course, in Sydney, but also online. And we went for a troop around all the different virtual places in Second Life. And I interviewed, I didn't book it, but I set us up in a virtual cafe, and we sat down, and I even had the logo, NFSA logo, on the wall. We started the virtual interview in the cafe with this. It was just a space I could find that was public, and then she toured me through various areas.
Today is the 14th of November 2013. This is a National Film and Sound Archive of Australia oral history with Paisley Beebe, the Second Life avatar of Leonie Smith, whom by no coincidence is the real life person I interviewed on the 17th of last month. Bad world.
What do I mean by the big bad world? Well, it's a bit like landing in a city by yourself, not having anywhere to stay, not knowing where you can stay and where's safe and where isn't. And you realise really quickly that the other cartoons that you're coming across are actually real people on another side of a keyboard, and they could be anywhere around the world, and they may speak your language, they may not. You feel very, very vulnerable. It's very interesting in Second Life how you very quickly start to identify with your own avatar and can feel nervous wandering around in what's basically a illustrated world. So when you go to a different place in Second Life, you have what's called landmarks, which are like bookmarks. And I have a file here of favourite bookmarks. And sometimes what I do when I'm playing around in here is I go and have a look at some of my old favourites and still see if they still exist, because lots of places change in Second Life. People come in and they build the most incredible places, and then they move on and do something else. I wonder if the Rose Theatre is still around. That was pretty amazing. That basically you can create just about anything in Second Life. Things that would cost an absolute fortune to build don't cost very much at all. So this is the art gallery around here. But it's a bit, gives you the experience of, possibly being in a European kingdom of some kind, Austria or Switzerland. Anyway, it's a massive place, this place. It's got heaps of different areas that you can walk around in and have a look in.
That's a whole different presentation, really, the whole Second Life one, and that was a big, long thing that we did. I'll probably finish with a bit of a demonstration of that. Tomorrow's Anzac Day, so of course you've got to have a bit of band play Waltz and Matilda singers. We have Eric here. You just talked about the accuracies in the song.
The band play Waltz and Matilda, my most famous songs, are at least 2, probably 3 historical inaccuracies in it. And a couple of glaring ones, one of which I knew about when I wrote the song. But I didn't think it mattered, because I was trying to convey an emotion.
Colin Hay, which I'm sure you'll all be waiting for this one. This interview took place before Greg Ham died and before the court case, the final judgment of the court case on the Kookaburra song was actually handed down. I had dinner with Jerry Spicer just a few nights ago in Castlemaine, and he just talked about that a little bit, not much. We mainly talked about tax and how they'd gotten into a bit of, might have got into a bit of bother had they not taken some particular advice. That's back on the subject of bands making or not making money. But as I said, Men at Work actually did make quite a bit of money, but they might have ended up paying as much money as they earned, as they owed in tax, double it. They would have to pay double it if they hadn't taken some particular advice. But anyway, here's Colin on the Kookaburra issue.
It came about through an episode of Spicks and Specks.
Out of a trivia
question, they said, what famous, I can't remember exactly the question, but I think it said what famous Australian folk song is the flute line of Down Under based on? And no one got it. And then they played it again, and then somebody said, "Oh, that's Kookaburra, it's the Old Gum Tree." Somebody from Larrikin Music Publishing was watching the show and told Norm Lurie, the boss of Larrikin Music Publishing, about it, and so he listened to it and decided to litigate. The original justice, gave the decision went to Larrikin about the fact that he said that there was indeed infringement of Kookaburra's copyright. It's on public record what his reasons are, but basically he said that there were 2 bars taken out of 4 musical bars of Kookaburra. Because Kookaburra goes and in Down Under you will find 2 of those bars. But the thing is that what the justice also acknowledged is the fact that, because I went and played the song and I said, look, this song was written in 1978, which it was. He accepted that. So I'm saying, look, this composition already existed. There was no band, there was no flute, there was no reference to any bird whatsoever.
Yes.
Men at Work's recording of that song was in fact an arrangement of an already existing work. So it hasn't got anything to do with copyright, because you can't copyright an arrangement. It's an arrangement of an already existing song, which did not have that flute riff in it. But he didn't buy that. Greg Ham, who played the flute, didn't know what he was playing. And I know that he didn't know what he was playing. He was looking for something which sounded vaguely Australian. Here we are in the studio. We've already got a song which we think is great.
Yeah.
How stupid would we have been? I mean, I've done some, stupid things in my life. Or why don't we take a bit of someone else's song and put it in our song? It's like the most ridiculous thing I've ever had in my life. And yet that's what they were playing. And so it's an appeal at the moment. They're appealing and we're appealing, so we'll see what happens. I don't believe that there was an infringement anyway. And the main reason is because you can look at, he's saying, okay, 2 bars out of 4 were taken.
Yes.
And we're saying, well, whilst that may well be the case in that arrangement of the song, for 27 or 28 years, nobody noticed.
So, it's quite interesting stuff. Anyway, while we're on Colin.
People associate our band with the America's Cup because that was such a high point, I think, culturally for Australia. And also just in terms of, it would have seemed anyway, it had a lot to do with the country's identity. So I think that's why it had that kind of power.
And they used the song as the theme. Every time there was anything.
Well, they used the song as a theme, and they used it. I like there's a lot of mythology around it now, but basically, as far as I can tell from, because I wasn't actually there at the time, when they were sailing the yacht, we were on tour in America.
Yeah.
But it was one of the crew who started to play it, just one of the, from the ranks of the crew on the boat, on the yacht. It wasn't some kind of corporate decision. Who said, let's scare the Americans with this song. And they would play it every day, really loud from their, and it did. It kind of had this. It had this confidence building effect on the Australian crew, and intimidated the Americans.
Oh God!
And so it worked on that level. But I love the fact that it was organic and it came from one of the crew, as opposed to it being something that was. But it was also, a year after the song had been a hit around the world. So people always associate. They go, you got famous because of that, because of the yacht race and everything. Which is
a year after it became a hit.
Yeah. And it had already been, and of course it had that effect in Australia. Yes. They would play the yacht race and they'd have the song.
Yes.
And it maybe sold another 15,000 copies or something like that. But it was in no way responsible for the success of the song, and that's why they that's why they used it. And it was
So on the Kookaburra song, I think the judge obviously did what he had to, but I don't think the defence handled it that well, because the song wasn't made up by the lady that's been the lyric and copyrighted it for. It was a folk song. Gangooly, gooly, gooly, watch it. Da 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 da. Got the bar sits in the old gum tree. That's where it came from. And she used to go to campfires. She was a girl guide mistress, and she there's no doubt she heard it there, and that's where that tune came from. So it's a shame that didn't get brought up. Anyway, I'm going to go straight on to Wally DeBacker.
Around that time, Peter Pasquale, the head of Creative Vibes, really liked the track I had called The Only Thing I Know, and he suggested that he thought a radio edit of it could be really interesting because it was like a 6-minute song. So I travelled to Sydney and spent some time in like the little in-house mixing studio that Creative Vibes had with their engineer, Jimbo.
And they shot.
And we looked at trying to do an edit and a remix. So it was also like a little bit of a testing ground, not only for me and Pete, but also kind of for Georgie and Paris from Groove Scooter to go, what if somebody remixed the track Wally had made in his bedroom? Let's see what it ends up like. Yes. So we did that, and Peter put that edit and remix of The Only Thing I Know that I did with Jimbo on a Creative Vibes compilation called, I don't remember what it was called now, something Vibes. They had a number of compilations they did called Evolutionary Vibes. So that was kind of my first official release on any kind of record labels thing, was to put this edit of The Only Thing I Know on Evolutionary Vibes 3, I think it was. And then I guess having got to speak to Peter and find out how Creative Vibes did business and what it was, business did, distributing records, quote unquote, I kind of thought, well, maybe I don't need a label like Groove Scooter when they can't offer me any money or any better direction. I should just release it myself and have them, do the one part of the process that over the last 6 months I'd worked out was a fool's game trying to do yourself, which was self-manufacturing and distributing records. And so, I just called Pete up and kind of went, would you distribute, Boardface if I pressed it up and covered all the costs? And he said, yeah, for sure. Peter from Creative Vibes just suggested, why don't we help you with a more mainstream press, like we'll send copies to The Age and to Herald Sun and to ABC Radio that you haven't contacted before, and we'll sort of follow up that side of things. So we kind of just split the release, promotion, publicity side of things in half, maybe roughly, and went about it. I pressed 1,000 copies, and I remember driving to the manufacturing place in Braeside to pick up these boxes of my CD and being horrified that the artwork came out completely different than it was meant to look. But when I've already gone through a few months of the annoying, painstaking process. So I went through 4 test pressings, finally went to double vinyl, more test pressings, and I've approved it all. And then they just ignore it. And they've already sold thousands of copies of a complete botched job, just ignoring the directions. That's when I'm like, whose responsibility was it to catch this? Well, I guess you make a lot of mistakes along the way. I guess you can laugh about them and you learn from them. I guess you haven't seen the mashup I did of other people covering somebody I used to know.
Oh, that rings a bell. Yeah.
So I've downloaded a few hundred videos of people covering the song and parodies of the film clip as well, and then edited bits of the video and audio into a new piece of about 6 minutes. There's so much of that out there on YouTube now. It's like these tentacles of the world's energy, and from everything from super slick professional productions to, as you say, sometimes, you know, really not very good stuff from amateurs with webcams.
Yes.
But it's wonderful, that tapestry, I think, that you can find. And I put the music together first in Ableton, and Ableton also does video. So all the edits I made to people's videos, audio-wise, were kind of matched as video snippets. I bounced all those video snippets out of Ableton as new time-matched, stretched videos to the audio result of my arrangement.
Yeah.
Then introduced all those, you know, correct time-stamped videos into After Effects, and did all the masking and split screening required to make them all play together in different parts of the screen.
Yes.
And then used Premiere for final single timeline edits. So
Okay.
involved a little bit of learning of both those Adobe programs that I hadn't done before, but that was part of the fun. It just became so obvious to me that in a way I was being presented like with something of a world first. I couldn't think of, you know, anyone else who had a song that had become so ubiquitous and that so many people had chosen to engage with. I worked it out yesterday. We did 160 something shows, I think, in the last 2 years. It's more than I've ever done before with the Gautier project, definitely. Probably done similar numbers with the basics before, but up until maybe 15 months ago, I was still struggling with it as an experience. Like, I wasn't happy with how the show was sounding, how I was performing and singing, and feeling like for all the effort, and even despite positive responses from a lot of fans, that I just wasn't happy with how it was sounding. So I had a 2-month period back in Australia in the middle of last year where I just knuckled down and just listed, just really straight up went, these are the things that I'm really not happy with in the show, and I'm pretty sure I know how they can get better.
And then my father turned up in Melbourne, and he knew I was penniless. My amp was in the railway yard somewhere. I had my guitar and not much else. And he wanted me to go back to Tasmania. And he said, "Look, why don't you come back? I'll get you. You know, you love art. I'll get you a job as you can do some sign writing or something. You know, it'll see you through." And I didn't want to know. And I saw an advertisement in 10th Avenue, which was a little gig in Burke Street. And it was for this band, Bay City Union, their guitar player had just gone back to Brisbane, and they wanted a guitar player. Anyway, Dad said, "Look, I really want you to come back." And I was I wasn't in any position to argue with him because I had nothing. You know, I was broke.
Yes.
I was absolutely penniless. And in a big city with nowhere to stay or anything. Dad said, "Look, I'd really like you to come back." And I said, "Oh, but Dad, I've got a job." She said, "Oh, yeah." I said, yeah, there's a band out in St Kilda I'm going to join called the Bay City Union. And he said, "Well," he said, "Are you sure?" And I said, yeah. He said, "I've got to go out that way. Why don't you get in the cab with me and we'll go and make sure you got the job okay." So I got there and I got out of the cab and I walked upstairs and knocked on the flat door, and Glenn Wheatley opened the door, and I said, "Hi, I'm Phil from the Blue Jays." "Yeah, I'm Phil. Look, I read you guys need a guitar player." And Glenn said, "Yeah, that's right." I said, "Well, hang on, I'll get my bags." And I went back to the cab and said to Dad, "It's all right, I've got the job." Meantime, Glenn's running round to Matt saying, "Hey, remember that blonde guitar player that was with Tony Worsley?" Matt said, "Yeah, he's just joined the band and he's moving in." So,
yeah, that's how
thanks, Dad. Got the job. And that was how I came to work with Matt Taylor.
Yeah, oh, really?
There's just no way in the world I wanted to go back to Tasmania.
Yeah. With 60 interviews, you multiply that by at least 4 hours, not an average job, but at least 4 hours, then you end up with over 250 hours. And there's a lot of things that I was hoping to sort of say. I thought of various different approaches, and at one stage I was even going to sing you a song. But what I did do was I'm going to try and share a clip that I did, which would sort of demonstrates what involves going with what happens in Second Life, because there's a whole planet going on in Second Life, and I imagine in Metaverse too, when it really establishes itself, that is running in parallel To a degree, not a major degree, but to a degree with real life, particularly when people go into lockdown. I thought it might explode during lockdown, but I only ventured in a few times myself to check stuff, and I just didn't not that often, so I can't really speak with authority, but it just looked as if it was a lot quieter, as if there wasn't an. I thought there would be a whole lot of new people doing it, but maybe they'd already discovered metaverse, but metaverse wasn't actually mentioned until well through that process. I'm not sure. I would have thought everyone's stuck at home, they'll just go online, but maybe there was a lot of people going online when they were home alone, like they weren't, they're stuck at home, and they just thought, oh, there's something to do, I'll go in there and socialise with people. Maybe when during lockdowns, everyone was home, so they couldn't do that. It was maybe a guilty pleasure or something, but I don't know. But it was very quiet. But anyway, here's a thing I did. I'll share my screen and hopefully it'll play for you, and we can have a laugh afterwards. So I'll plug everything, I'll plug a couple of things in again.
What did you plug that into?
I'll plug it into that and then into that one. Plug it all in?
That into the wrong one.
Oh dear.
Ladies and gentlemen, and others, welcome to virtual reality. Now, for the very first time in virtual reality, let me present to you, what's his name? Dodsworth.
Thanks for dropping into my VR show. There's a few acronyms. RL means real life, SL means in world, RES means to materialise in world,
Online.
or teleport in, so without any more mucking around. I was hanging around Digital Town on Moosehead Beach when I first met with Peaches, and she read some pixels with me. She chose my body, she made my face, she created my image and decked out my place, and she read some pixels with me. And a digital sky is always blue, switches sun to noon every hour or two, and head to the beaches, and beaches will find you. Gonna sing that? And a digital sky is always blue, set your sun to noon every hour or two, and head to the beaches. Beaches might find you. She stole away my SL heart, right till the end, right from the start. You should have seen us, Peaches, Quinley and me. But if you don't keep SL and RL apart, you will wind up wearing your RL heart on your cartoon sleeve, which just looks like a box. And a digital sky is always blue, set your sun to noon every hour or two, and head to the beaches, and Peaches might find you. So now my Quingley, she's out of reach. She TP'd away, she rezzed on some other beach, and she blocked me. Now there's just an empty space in my list. I don't know if I should laugh or cry. I don't know if she was a girl or guy, pulling my strings, or in this case, jerking my chain. And now I'm back in my RL hell, with the jigsaw pieces of my SL shell and counting the pixels that Peaches shared with me. Everybody, and the digital sky is always blue. Set your sun to noon every hour or two and head to the beaches and Peaches might find you. And a digital sea is always green. I set my moon to noon every hour or three. I don't know if you can actually do that. And I head to the beach and Peaches might find me. Peaches Cringley and me. Peaches Cringley and me. We almost rhymed with three. Peaches Cringley and me.
No advertised sustained permanent. Yes. Graham, you're really producing stuff along this line, aren't you, at the moment?
Correct, yes, I am, yep, that's right. I produced the whole of this. But I'd sometimes use the characters, a number of characters, to demonstrate some of the folk songs that I throw up on YouTube. It just can be a little tacky, so. Anyway, that's available on YouTube if people really want to punish themselves with it again. Pardon? It's just about to finish. I'll.
Make this film.
Yeah, I made it completely. Yeah, all of it.
Made it completely. My goodness gracious.
I'll explain it further in a second.
That's fantastic. Gosh. Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, well.
Graham, look, we have got we could squeeze in a couple of questions or comments if anybody. We haven't got anything waiting in the chat room at the moment, I see. So
yeah.
Is there anybody else who wants to add any comment, or should we just in somewhat overwhelmed fashion, I must admit.
I must apologise for the disparate sort of way the whole thing was put together, but I was on the fly. I won't make any. Never apologise. Never explain. My father told me, so I'll just shut up.
I was
interested
interested in the early days of synthesizers, and I was quite into electronics at the time, and actually I was one of those people whose father built a television set.
Really?
For 56 out of Radio Hobbies project. We actually got a black and white TV working, and that got me interested, probably mostly in electronics. And but you know, the Fairlight.
Yep.
I'm always surprised how few people know that it was an
That's
Australian
right. Yeah.
manufactured and invented instrument.
Yeah, in those days when I bought a digital sample of Mirage, it was $3,500. But at the time, the Fairlight was the top of the range for something like $300,000. It was enormously expensive. The Synclavier, or it may have been the Synclavier, that was $300,000. Sting had one of those. Then maybe the Fairlight, and then Emulator 2, and then the Mirage. And it was just the four samplers that were around at that particular time. One of the bands actually did a clip with it, and they'd added an extra one to the emulator, making everyone think that Emulator 3 had been released, but it hadn't been. It was just it's an incidental joke on stage. But there was, I think, 2 was as high as they went, the emulators, but they were just so expensive. The Mirage, which I got a demonstration model from the first 3 into the country, it cost me $3,500 then. So, because it was a demonstration model, basically. So, you know, they weren't cheap. And that's 1986 or 7 or something like that, I think. I might have been 84 or 85, yeah. Yeah, interesting stuff.
Yeah, I might add in there, Graham, in about 86 or 87, the archive made a TV series in conjunction with what became the 10 Network, called The Australian Image, and it was 12 episodes. It was basically about the work of the archive, and with a lot of film, television, and sound history thrown in. And there's a whole entire sequence on the Fairlight pointing out that yes, it's an Australian invention, and and demonstrating it, etc. So that was an episode about Australian inventiveness in the media, and yes, it was. I remember being quite taken with it at the time, but it's demonstrated. And I think in the same episode, there's a band called Spy versus Spy, or Spy v Spy, which is melded into that.
They were very. I mean, it's the same with software and everything nowadays. So, you get a new piece of software and you just get an upgrade to it, to an old piece of it, and it's so complicated. It's very hard there. It's difficult to use. You really have to almost be a professional musician with you dedicate your life to it. You know, I don't think there's not people who can actually teach how to drive them sometimes with all this technology, particularly back in the 80s. Yeah. So that's interesting. I find it interesting because you didn't see a lot of bands they cost too much, didn't they?
Oh, yeah.
Graham, it's Judy here. Can I just keep on the television theme? You reminded me that in my family photographs, I've got a photograph of my dad, who was about mid-30s at the time, and his mate Arthur Robbie in Ballarat, sitting on a stage playing guitar. And there's this dirty big television camera in one side of the photograph, and it was a test broadcast for the introduction of television. And I'd forgotten all about that until you mentioned that, the interviews and things you did. So
I thought it was amazing that Phil Manning's father set up an aerial in Tasmania. Because of the 56 games coming. I mean, that would have been a lot of work. He had a kit and stuff like that, but he obviously had a lot of understanding of that kind of stuff. But to know that he could get a signal from the other side of Bass Strait, to go to all that trouble, and for it not to work is unthinkable, really. Yeah. But he apparently also put together a television camera. That's pretty special, isn't
it? They knew that this sort of thing was possible because civil aviation had problems during what they call sporadic E propagation. Launceston air traffic control frequencies interfered in Melbourne. Under certain propagation, those frequencies get huge distances, and frequency changes had to be made to stop interference from the mountain just out of Launceston where they have their transmitters, which is quite high. So across barrier, Bass Strait signals were well known to radio amateurs and people like civil aviation.
Well, Phil Manning's father actually was employed to, or had some sort of business sort of going around finding the best spots for aerials, apparently, around Tasmania at some point. So any questions about any of the interviewing? I tried to give you a cross-section of a lot of the detail, also some of the general questions, and little bit of the style, but I don't know if
Graham, I think we're going to have to shut up shop, or else we're likely to disappear into the ether.
Cut off. Thanks for attending.
Very appreciative comments from the chat room, and particularly one saying, when are we going to have part 2? So you can take that on board too.
That'd be great. I could, because there's a lot I'd like to. There's a lot of that stuff.
You've provided a fantastic amount of an unbelievable amount of information. I mean, the content of what is included in all these sound recordings that you've made for the National Film and Sound Archive, it just contains so much of enormous value, you know, both socially, technologically, musically, and so on. And as for your final ending with your Second Life stuff, well, I'm just bowled over by that. I'm sure everybody else is too. So I think we'll have to finish up now and say thank you very much, Graham, for a most fascinating afternoon. Thank you.
Bravo, Graham.
Yes. Thank you for well done, Graham. Thank you. Thanks for coming along.
Many thanks.
And you'll have to see us out, Graham, since you're actually our
host.
Our
yeah, I hosted. Yeah. Well, again, thanks for coming on. We'll catch most of you around again.
And Ruth, we enjoyed you at the Folk Festival.
Hello, thank you. It wasn't quite as sophisticated as Graham's Second Life performance.
No. Are you going to Cabarga?
No, not this year, unfortunately. Maybe next year.
I've been considering it, but maybe next year.
Sabina's got some good photos of you.
Oh, cool. Yeah, no, thank you, Graham. Thanks, everybody. It's really interesting. See ya.
I put my pleasure and my pain. See you, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, we all